So welcome everyone. Welcome to this, the third Contact Live webinar. Welcome to a very sunny UK here. I'd like to introduce Sabine Louet, who is going to present our webinar today, which is entitled Why Evidence-Based Content Matters More Than Ever and How to Make the Most of Remote Working Solutions to Deliver It. So I hope for many it will be particularly pertinent at the moment. Sabine is a media entrepreneur and science communicator. Personally, she's a big friend of Contech. I know she's been developing SciencePOD, which is her main business since 2014, and we're really excited to have her talking about content marketing. I'm just going to say a very few words about how this will work. We're using Zoom webinar. Your mic's already muted. We really would like some questions posed. You can use the Q&A tab at the bottom to do that. We'll run through the questions towards the end. Ideally, we've got a 30-minute time frame. So hopefully Sabine will talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll wrap up with a little Q&A session to just finish it. That really is all from me. All I need to do now is with great pleasure to hand over to Sabine. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Clive, and welcome to all of you watching live. So we're here today sharing with you from Dublin, Ireland, which is very much as sunny as the UK seems to be. I'm going to start by sharing my screen so that you can all follow. The topic today that we're going to cover is evidence-based content. And we're going to look in details as to why this sort of content matters more than ever before, particularly for educational, informational, and also marketing purposes. And because we're all watching from the comfort of our own homes, it's very important that we also get a sense as to how you, in your own capacity, can make the most of a remote working solution to create your own content. So before I dive deep into the topic, I wanted to share a bit about the fact that there are a few trends influencing the way we communicate nowadays. As you know, open access is one of the key topic that is of concern of the industry, and open access is particularly changing the way publishers are doing their marketing. There is a shift from journal-led to author-led marketing. And that's primarily because of the bigger change in the way people communicate through social media networks. So piggybacking on existing network is an important aspect of what people do in our industry. Another important trend is that people, particularly scientists in receipt of public funds, are very much encouraged to be more accountable and more transparent in the outcome of their research. So funders are pushing for this, policymakers are pushing for this, but also a lot of people are becoming more concerned about how they could benefit from the outcome of some research. I mean, COVID-19 is a prime example of that happening. The third trend, which really frames the context in which we operate, is that fake news, as you might have noticed on your mobile phones, and misinformation travel much faster than validated information. And we've all witnessed this, and the reason why this is happening is because fake news typically are formulated using a language that's much more certain, which makes it more credible, more believable, and very often there's no source being quoted. And finally, the fourth trend that's really framed the way people in marketing and in communication capacity operate is the fact that we're in a 24 hours publishing schedule. It's always on, and publishers tend to need to produce more content with less time and without compromising on quality. And that's a very important word, quality, because it's, in a sense, this is what surrounds the concept of evidence-based content. So now, let's get back to our topic. Why does evidence-based content matter? Typically, this current situation that we're witnessing with the pandemic has helped us understand more than ever why this is important. We've witnessed that wider audiences have shown a lot of interest for the research results, particularly in the medical field, particularly in the field associated with finding a cause, finding a cure, finding ways of preventing the like of COVID-19. But not only that, it really shows an increased interest in research-based information. And this is why evidence-based content is popular. Now, I would like to just give you a bit of a definition as to what we mean by evidence-based content, because different people use this term for different purposes. But typically, it would be content that's created on the basis of the best available evidence. And what these suggest is that there's an element of curation or selection surrounding the creation of that content. Someone has to decide what is the best available research evidence out there in publications. And it also needs to focus on the work of scientists with the right expertise, because there's no point quoting an immunologist when you're having a discussion on epidemiology. And it's very important that any content that you create connects in one way or the other to the original source, particularly when you're a science publisher, because you're the prime source, the prime producer of original primary content. And the last piece of definition that I can attach to this evidence-based content is that it needs to suitably target the right audience. It means it needs to be written in a way that the audience will understand it. And that doesn't necessarily mean dumbing it down, because sometimes you're trying to reach out to a community of biologists with a physics paper, and physics methods are very much often used in other disciplines. So sometimes it's about bridging the gap between scientific discipline. Sometimes it's about also convincing policymaker about the importance of the result. And sometimes it's all about transfer to industry, to application, and ultimately to society. So now, before we go a bit further, I'd like to take a trip into history. And I would like to refer to the work of Claude Shannon, who is famous for his information theory. At the time of his work, what Shannon did was to look at what happens when someone sends information from a sender to a receiver with a little bit of noise in between. And he was looking at the criteria that affect the effective communication of the information. And one of the aspects that he uncovered at the time was to say that effective communication passes through redundant messages. And if you look just simply at the written language, the way we write in English, for instance, 50% of the language in its written form is actually redundant. It means it contains communication and words that actually repeat the same notion as other words in the same sentence. And that is a fundamental principle for anyone involved in communication, redundancy. So let me move on to how to effectively convey messages when you're trying to educate an audience or share information or ultimately do marketing like a lot of the publishers tend to need. And in order to get to the point where you establish your content strategy, you first need to decide the purpose and the audience. But also, as point number 2 in this graph shows, you need to define your key message, your positioning. What are you going to try to tell to people? What's your story? And once you have that one key message, then you can move on to the next part in the process. The process of communication, effective communication, then requires that this particular message is then translated into different formats. Typically, publishers would use a blog post, and then they would create a social media card to attract people to that blog post, or maybe send an email alert with a newsletter where some of the content will also feature. In other cases, when they celebrate the anniversary of the creation of some of their journals or their book collection, then they might go a bit more in depth into webinar territory or ebook or white papers. And the essential part here is that the message will then be communicated through different formats that are suited for the next step. And those formats, the next step being the distribution. And this is how effective communication works, is that you'd have one key message, multiple formats in which that message is expressed, so that those messages can effectively be conveyed through different channels, be it video, text, audio, and so on. At the end of that process, that's when you start measuring the engagement. And we're going to talk in more details in a minute about what are those tools available for people to do work remotely. And ultimately, once you are able to measure engagement, gauge the level of return on investment. And all of you, I know, are fully tied up with accountability for every cent that you spend, and it's even more true in the current context. So, what are the actual working, remote working solutions that can help you? A lot of you would be used to working from an office, communication with colleagues day in, day out by the coffee machine. That's not always possible anymore. So what do people do? They tend to organize themselves in the cloud, in the virtual world. And I want to point to a recent survey organized by Newscreed that really showed that those companies who have planning and project management virtual tools are the best off when it comes to occupying their workforce. And having these tools in-house as part of their processes really helps decreasing how you reallocate the work to your staff. In particular, less than 29% of people's resources need to be realigned when you change activity, going from an office-based to a home-based working life, if you have planning and project management tools available to you. And that really goes to show that the shared tools that are available online bear the brunt of change. They're able to be adjusted in an agile manner much quicker than if you had to brief someone to reorganize life in a home office environment. So if we go back to the diagram from before, I've sliced it back into stages. So at the idea and conception stage, when it comes to deciding what kind of communication you're going to do, there are a lot of tools that are available for collaboration. And the typical example that I've put on the screen here is the Trello. Some of them probably would already have used Trello. But there are many others like Asana, Evernote, and so on. And these tools all do the same: is they allow a bunch of people to get together and to decide on key tasks, prioritize this task, and of course allocate various team members. And so that would be typically how people start getting to work on their strategy. They do half of it through documentation, through those shared collaborative tools, which are designed to plan. Essentially, there's a calendar element to it as well. And probably the other half of the discussion will happen through Zoom or through any of these sort of video conferencing tools that really help people decide how to work their strategy. Now, typically the reason why the way people go about working out their strategy is by order of priority. is to increase brand awareness. This is even more important in an open access environment because everybody's competing for attention. There's obviously an element of keeping the loyalty to your magazine or to your brand of publication going. That's an important aspect and an important reason for communicating. Other people just want to increase the number of people reading their original content, you know, increase traffic and usage. And others want just to increase the number of submissions to their journal, for instance. So there's a lot of reason why people need to communicate through content marketing in particular, and they're laid out here. The reason why I've given you now a calendar is because I can never emphasize enough the need to plan ahead. And planning ahead is the secret for having effective content marketing or communication approaches. Because the more you organize, the more you have economies of scales when you're going to be planning your content. This is a dummy calendar that just gives an idea about, you know, how many pieces of content need to be created for a typical journal, but that's based on our experience. Now, how do we create the content is the core of this presentation, because that's our core expertise as well. As Clive said in the beginning, we are a company that was created a few years ago, over 5 years ago now, and our core business is about providing a platform in the virtual world. And there are other platforms like ours out there who are providing similar functionalities. The difference is that we're specialized in creating content about science, about technology, about medicine. So that's the main difference. But those core elements are available to you as you're working from your home office to start organizing the creation of your content to fulfill your strategy and have your planning fully catered for. So as you can see at the top of the right-hand side wheel, there is editorial process management is the core of creating the content. Sometimes people come to me and say, oh, I need a writer to do this piece of content. And it's like, of course you need a writer. That's about 25% of the activity of creating content. The reality is when you want to create quality evidence-based content, it starts with the slice in red, the curation. You need to be able to select the most relevant content, the most relevant evidence-based content. And from there, you can go on and create your team, writer, editors, proofreader. And what our platform does is to really coordinate the work of these people through pre-program workflow and also an authoring tool so that people can actually write directly on the platform. And not only that, but it also allows anyone to log in, decide how much content they want, you know, 10, 20 pieces for the next 3 months, 6 months, and then allocate each content brief to a dedicated team who has the right expertise. And in particular, you can see these are some of the people in our community. And when I say they have the right expertise, they typically would have a science or engineering or medical degree. Very often they have PhD level qualification. And on top of that, they have worked for the media or for a publishing house. So this is the secret recipe, the secret ingredient in a successful content creation piece of work, is that you need to allocate, you need to find the right talent, and you need to make sure that talent is working in an harmonious way without wasting any time through pre-program workflows. Once you've managed to create your content, you then move on to the next stage, which is content distribution tools. So again, for people working remotely, there is a lot of available solutions out there to do exactly that. So for instance, most of you would be familiar with the lack of Hootsuite for social media distribution. There are many more solutions out there who have various levels of complexity, but that's not the only way. And clearly, when I come back to my original, to the beginning of my talk, when I was putting a lot of emphasis on planning, planning is also essential in the distribution. And in order to help you out, everything can be scheduled in advance. There are solutions called digital marketing platforms, such as HubSpot or ActiveCampaign, that allow you to pre-program when you send a piece of content, and depending on the reaction on the people you're sending it to, whether they ignore the email or whether they engage with you, then you send a different piece of content in your course. So a lot of these things can be automated nowadays, and those tools are fairly sophisticated, but also fairly time efficient. So a lot of the things that happen is that when people work from home, they sometimes feel they're not as productive as in the office, but the reality is if you are able to harness those tools, you're going to gain in efficiency tremendously. And of course, when it comes to distribution, there's a lot of automation, there's a lot of tools out there who can help you place your content in the right audiences. I mean, a classic one when it comes to influencing a wider public or wider audience would be to go through the likes of Alpha Galileo, which really is a broker service for journalists. So then your content gets picked up by professional journalists who go on to write stories. But it could be just more, you know, sponsored type links, like the likes of TrendMD would do, Google Ad, or LinkedIn AdWords. So there's a lot of options out there that marketers are very familiar with. Now, this is the most important part of this discussion on evidence-based content. Evidence-based content is key in your entire communication effort. There's always a temptation to add a lot of bells and whistles in your distribution, you know, the best analytics, the best distribution. But if you don't have quality content to distribute, there's not much point in investing time and effort in distribution. Your return on investment, the level of engagement that you're going to get, really depends on the quality of your content. Without that content, it's a bit like a house without foundation. You're not going to get the kind of return on investment that you need. And what's unique about the way we approach this evidence-based content is we have the community with the right scientific expertise and the communication skills to make it happen. And I think, you know, you cannot underline enough how important that aspect is, because anyone can write, but not everyone can write evidence-based content. It's a skill, it's something that's done by a professional, and in order to get the return on investment and the level of engagement, it needs to be done well. So spare your cents and your euros and your dollars and for distribution. As long as you don't have the right content, this is only going to work once you have evidence-based content. So of course, return on investment is important to all of you, and it's all about being accountable. And ultimately, for publishers, it's all about adding value to authors. And in order to, for content marketing to be effective nowadays, it needs to be focused on making authors shine. So I'll give you a few examples of successful content that we've created. This is an example from the European Physical Journal, published by Springer. We did a 300-word summary of a research paper on Bitcoin. And the feedback we received from the author was quite amazing when he had tens of pages reproducing that piece of content that was obviously made available for free. But it was picked up, it was translated. You could see there's some Portuguese version there at the bottom. And the scientists just couldn't believe the number of discussion that it generated. So that's what I call impact. We had another lovely story with this particular group of journals, in that we did another summary of a physics paper on the physics of champagne, and that happened to be published just before Christmas. So the piece was distributed through the likes of Alpha Galileo and picked up by one of the journalists registered there. And it ended up being a very short story in the New York Times. So the publishers were thrilled. Of course, when it comes to impact, it's also about how professional publishers evaluate the quality and the difference that it makes to use this sort of content for content marketing. And you can see in the qualitative comments made by the then editor in charge of this sort of activity. She's since then moved on, but she could see the benefit for her brand, and she could see the benefit for her authors, who were ever so grateful every time one of those stories was picked up. So I know you like numbers, so I didn't spare you this time. For a typical news story like this, 300, 500 words, that would then be distributed on social media, you can expect for a very, very good topic, around 12,000 clicks. 12,000 clicks makes it about 8 cents per click, only for creating the content, not for the distribution. And that also corresponds typically to an increase in the number of downloads to their 30% based on our anecdotal experience. When it comes to video content that's attached to original research, we tend to we've got numbers that say it's about 80% higher frequency of access compared to not having the video. So we know this works, we know it's effective, and we know that we have numbers to prove it. So a lot of the people we deal with tend to ask us, but you have all these formats that are possible. What's the best format for my purpose? And that's a very important question, very, very important question. So it really depends on what you're trying to promote or to share. In the case, for instance, of databases, which are probably one of the trickiest type of content to promote, what we've done in the past is to write case studies of how scientists had successfully used this database. We have other examples for people publishing academic books. What we've done in the past is book reviews, and book reviews have this very interesting aspect in that they are shareable because they're well written, they're engaging, and that means that the audience is doing the distribution, not so much the publisher, but more the audience, because they're compelled by what they read. Of course, you can also go back to the more standard news story, one piece of research, one news story. I mean, who wants an excuse to eat chocolate as if you needed it? But, we love these kind of stories. Another kind of format that works very, very well on social media is the infographic. Again, this one was based on the single research paper from Elsevier, I believe. And when you have enough of these pieces, you can actually collect them into a single page, which would be your go-to page, your reference page for your journal or for your collection of journals or your book collection. And that way you can showcase the best of your research papers for the year. Now, when I talked about repurposing content for in various formats, I also meant that you can sometimes create content in different languages. In this case, we created Chinese language first content. So this was based on a piece of research in English, obviously, but the coverage was done in Chinese directly. And we're very excited about this because everybody involved hadn't done this sort of social media work before, and it's been very, very popular. Now, let's go back to the author, because for publishers, it's all about the authors. There are other formats that lend themselves very well to promoting the author and make them the center stage. The standard Q&A type format really is very popular, but sometimes you want to do a variation, and you can do a profile that really talks about the scientists, about the history of why they came about to study this particular topic, and that again makes them more likable and makes it easier to share for the audience. We've also experienced of doing podcasts, all sorts of podcasts. They're very, very popular because people can listen to them on their mobile on their way to work. And we've also recently expanded it to the video. And if you see the video on the right-hand side of the screen, which is about how to do homeschooling during COVID-19 and what are the lessons learned from academic experts in this field. That's published on the Brill blog. You can find out about the kind of quality that we produce. Now, creating evidence-based content, as I've described it, which means involving professional review, professional editors, writers, proofreaders, is a skill that is available to all of you as long as you use those remote tools that are available out there. It's important to bring the information out of the silo with magazine-style content so that the wider audiences that you're trying to influence can also be reached. And stories that add value by reaching new audiences and increasing impact mean that it will also echo into the profile of the brand who's promoting them. So there's enough tools. You can look around. You now know the bare principle of how to go about it. I'm very much available to answer any question you have. But the future is bright. There are many, many more stories to be told in science, and we're very excited about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's just go back. Thank you so much, Sabine. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. As a guy who spent quite a lot of time as a publisher, I will listen all day long to people talking about how important the quality of content is and how you go about making that content. We haven't had any questions from the group at the moment, but I'd quite like to just get a ball rolling on that very quickly by asking you, how exactly do you ensure the quality of the content?
Right, very important question. So typically it's all in the processes. As you know, publishing is all about processes. But typically what we do is for each piece of content, you'd have a writer for written text, you'd have a writer, and then you have a dual quality control in that you also allocate an editor and a proofreader. So in exactly the same way that people work when they work in front matter, they have iterative rounds between writer and editor, and then eventually it goes on to the proofreader and of course to the author to be checked. But it's all about having enough rounds of review in the process so that it's possible to make quality control, and we do this through the platform. You know, when I used to work as an editor in a live office, there was a lot of emailing back and forth, uploading, downloading file, being on the phone for endless phone calls, whereas now everything's documented in a centralized place where people can see the history, the version history. There's nothing so different from the way manuscripts are being done, but this is a simplified version for front matter because it doesn't require the same level of complexity in the workflow.
Yeah, I totally agree. Fantastic. That's excellent. We've more or less run out of time. I wanted to just flag up that we're actually meeting with the conference chairs for our main content conference, which is going to happen in December, tomorrow, and we are actually using a Trello board to work through the submissions. So we've seen your enthusiasm, and I could certainly echo that is a fantastic tool to use for that sort of work. Thanks once again, Sabine. Thanks for all of you who attended. The video, which will be transcribed and indexed, will be available within 24 hours. Just a few dates for people who are attending. We're working on 4 more webinars, which we'll announce tomorrow, running from next week. The first one is about creating personalized curriculums for students using AI. So another context relevant topic. That's being hosted by Michael Puskar from Oega Technologies, all the way from Colombia. So please do join us for that one. We've got the Contact Forum on the 9th of June, which is our first fully online whole day event. We're developing that. More news on Contact Live website, all about that. Thank you so much for joining us. All I need to do now is thank Sabine one more time and say, I hope we'll see you all again this time next week. Goodbye. Thanks, Sabine.
Goodbye. Thank you.